Well, good morning and Shabbat Shalom. This is Valley Beth Shalom Torah study for Shabbos morning. I'm Rabbi Ed Feinstein, coming to you direct from beautiful, rainy Southern California.
I don't believe that. You say it, but I don't believe
It's
it.
pouring outside.
I lived there 6 years. We had 2 rainy days.
Right, we saved it up for this weekend.
Oh my God.
And joined this morning as well by my dear friend, Rabbi Marc Gellman from South Florida. Well, good morning, Marc. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom, my friend.
Shabbat Shalom. So this Shabbos, we want to take a moment and offer a prayer for your daughter, Mara, who is going through a cancer surgery that is very serious. And we pray for the skill of the physician, the effectiveness of the medications, and her strength and resolution to get through this, and hope that refuah shlema, that it's a full, complete recovery, and that she's back with us very, very, very soon.
Thank you.
It's important. And this morning, we are opening the very last section of the book of Genesis, the very last portion of the book of Breshit, Vayechi. In this Torah portion, we're going to see the conclusion of the first chapter, as it were, of Jewish existence, our chapter as a family. In this portion, Jacob is going to pass away, bless his sons, and then die and be buried back in Canaan. And then Joseph is going to die. And the generation of the Jewish people as a family is going to come to an end. And as we turn the page to next week's Torah portion, we begin our experience as a people. And as a people, we begin as slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, the liberation from Egypt, and what's going to follow. But this is the end of the book of Genesis. And into this ending section of the book of Genesis, we're going to sort of wrap up all of the sort of loose ends. The brothers are going to come together. They're going to receive Jacob's blessings, and the people of Israel is going to settle comfortably in the land of Goshen. And that sort of sunsets this section. And that's what we're reading in Torah this morning. But there's other events this morning that we, Rabbi Gellman and I, would like to mark. And specifically, this weekend marks a special moment in the life of modern Judaism. You know that in Jewish life, we do not commemorate the birthdays of great people, because on the day they were born, they were just like all the rest of us, screaming infants. What we do is we commemorate the yahrzeit, the anniversary of the death of a great person, because that's when we got to see the full flowering of a great spiritual personality. And this weekend, this Parsha recognizes the 50th yahrzeit of the great philosopher and rabbi and teacher, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. Heschel's career spans from his birth in Poland in 1907 to a very, very thick Hasidic, deep Hasidic family. He left that family as a 16-year-old to go to high school in Vilna, and then ended up in Berlin, where he took his PhD in philosophy. And as the war was beginning, as the Second World War was about to break out, he left Europe to go to England for a year, and then finally to Cincinnati, Ohio. He was rescued by Hebrew Union College, where he taught Bible and Hebrew for 5 years. And in 1945, he landed in the Jewish Theological Seminary, in my alma mater, in the Upper West Side of Manhattan, of New York, where he completed his career. He passed away in December of 1972, this week, 50 years ago. Heschel's an extraordinary religious personality, an extraordinary social activist, an extraordinary teacher of Judaism. You can see that his writings are widely available. And if you've never read any Heschel, I really recommend this. It is a life-changing experience. If you've never read Heschel, then the easiest way to begin is with his little book called The Sabbath. It is the most accessible of all of his books. And you'll see that that really is a doorway into the whole world of his thought. Heschel comes from this deeply Hasidic world, and he is living in a scientific American culture. And he wants to open up for us a way of understanding the deep religious life that the world he came from. The other way to experience Heschel, if you're so inclined, is a few weeks before his death in 1972, he gave an interview for NBC television. You can Google it, it's online, and watch him. And it's extraordinary, of course, because, we don't have a lot of videotape of Maimonides. But to watch an hour of conversation with him, to look into his eyes and to hear his voice is really, really quite remarkable. Marc, did you ever meet him? Did you ever get a chance to learn with him?
No, I didn't, but my friends did. David Novak did, a few people did. And, I read everything. And I would add, I definitely believe reading the Sabbath is the best place to begin with Heschel, but also the collection about him by his daughter, Susanna. But the four great books, the Sabbath, Man is Not Alone, God in Search of Man, and of course his life work, The Prophets. And that they said once about Maimonides, it's hard to believe when you look at what Maimonides produced that it was produced by one man. You think when you look at the work of Maimonides, Guide for the Perplexed, the Mishnah Torah, that you say this was produced by a yeshiva, by an entire yeshiva. And Heschel is like that. But in addition to his voluminous and extraordinary literary and theological career, he is the man who made Judaism confront the issues of the modern world. And he did it in two ways that were well known: his support for the civil rights movement, his friendship with Martin Luther King. My friend Richard Newhouse, Christian theologian, was dear friends with Heschel, and they would have Passover Seder together every year. They called him Father Abraham. And so civil rights was embraced by him. And also the Soviet Jewry issue was really taken up by him as well. So what he showed is that Judaism must be relevant to the main issues of our time, to the main secular and ethical issues of our time. And both he and King are refutations of what you hear a lot, primarily from the left, in their criticism of right-wing pro-life people who are using their religious beliefs to direct their beliefs on abortion. No one ever said that about Martin Luther King. He's using his religious beliefs to support his views on civil rights. So they said, absolutely, you should use your religious beliefs. You could be wrong, but you have every right to use them. And he did. And he explained how Judaism must speak to discrimination in America. And it also must speak to the freedom of the enslaved Jews in the former Soviet Union. So he was extraordinary that way. And there's stories that partly Heschel lives on in these extraordinary stories that are told about him. And my friends who did study with him, to directly answer your question, told me stories that I don't think anyone knows except me and the people in the class that day. One day, Heschel's teaching his class. He was a professor of ethics and mysticism, but it was just Heschel. The class was Heschel. Whatever it was he taught, who cared? You're dealing with a great one of the Gedolei Hador, the great ones of the generation. So he's teaching this class on blood in an egg, which makes the egg treif because it has blood mixed into it. And the question is, eggs cost some money, so you didn't want poor people to have to lose an egg because of a little drop of blood. And there's a big debate about it. And he then finishes the whole halacha about blood in an egg. And he looks at the class and he says, gentlemen, you now know everything there is to know about blood in an egg. I pray that you will also be just as good at detecting blood in money. That was Heschel. That Judaism must understand the ethical consequences of our beliefs to our culture. Mm-hmm. And the other story, the famous story, a lot of people tell it many different ways. The way I heard it was this. He was on the Selma March, Selma to Montgomery March, with Martin Luther King, arm in arm. the famous picture of them walking together. And, Heschel looked like a rabbi, let's face it, Eddie. He had this shock of white hair. Well, I have the white hair. And he had a big beard, but he looked like a rabbi. I admit this. I look like the guy who said, I'm sorry, your loan has not been approved. But okay, he looked like a rabbi. And he's walking with King, and apparently some racist reporter sticks a microphone in his face and says, so Rabbi, what are you doing here? These aren't your people. And Heschel looked at him. He said, well, I came down here to pray. And the reporter won't give up. And he says, well, Rabbi, I've been watching you, and your lips have not been moving. And Heschel just looked at him and said, son, today I'm praying with my feet. So that was Heschel. That was Heschel. He was a poet. To me, his greatness was in his poetic version of Judaism and his courage to connect Judaism to the world in which we live.
I never met him personally. I met his
Really?
daughter. Yes, Susanna, I know, and we very well. But I'll tell you how I didn't meet his writing, his work.
Mm-hmm.
I was 17 years old, a freshman in college, and my mother called on a Friday afternoon for Shabbos. She says, when you come home for Thanksgiving, the rabbi wants you to lead a service for other college kids that are coming home. And I said to my mother, I said, Mom, that's not for me anymore. Tell the rabbi thank you, but no thank you. So the next week, Mom calls and she says, the rabbi would like to see you when you come home. So I come home. He was a loving, sweet rabbi. He wasn't angry at me. He said, what's the problem? And I said, look, I love you. I love the shul. I love Torah. I'm not abandoning the Jewish people. But God, I got to tell you, the life of the synagogue just isn't for me anymore. I mean, this was during the Vietnam War and during the birth of feminism and during every social movement that I was caught up with as a young person. And the shul just didn't reflect any of that. And I just said, it's just not for me anymore. He said, he didn't get mad. He said, okay. He said, do me a favor, turn around and take that orange book off the shelf, the one at the very end. So I took the book off the shelf. He said, open to the very first page and read out loud for me. I'll put up on the screen what I read, because I remember this very vividly. So this is what I read. It said, it is customary to blame secular science and anti-religious philosophy for the eclipse of religion in modern society. It would be more honest to blame religion for its own defeats. Religion declined not because it was refuted, but because it became irrelevant, dull, oppressive, and insipid. I said, hey, he's been to our shul, When faith is completely replaced by creed, worship by discipline, love by habit, when the crisis of today is ignored because of the splendor of the past, when faith becomes an heirloom rather than a living fountain, when religious speaks only in the name of authority rather than the voice of compassion, its message becomes meaningless. Religion is an answer to our ultimate questions. The moment we're oblivious to those ultimate questions, religion becomes irrelevant and its crisis sets in. The rabbi said, take the book home and read the rest of the book. Those are the opening words of God in Search of Man. Here is a man who is deeply religious. He comes from this deeply mystical, spiritually powerful Hasidic background, and that lives in him. But he's a fish out of water. He's living in a scientific, secular culture, which sees him as bizarre, as peculiar, as strange, that sees his beliefs as superstitions and folkways and lacking in any. So what he tries to do is he says religion wasn't displaced by science. It's simply that we forgot the questions that religion was coming to answer. We forgot that way of looking at the world. And in forgetting that way of looking at the world, we have left a part of us behind. For Heschel, religion is a way of knowing the world. It is a species of knowledge. And by leaving that way of knowing the world behind, we are unable to answer certain fundamental questions about life. about the meaning of life and the purpose of life, and to be sensitive to the moments that really matter in life. And that's what his philosophy attempts to do, is to show us, to build a bridge from the way we know the world to the way he knows the world. And it's an extraordinary philosophical experiment. Many people accuse him of being more a poet than a philosopher, because the truth of the matter is, when you think about this, how on earth can you get scientific, secular, skeptical people to open up a certain sensibility to see the world through the eyes of a religious person? But that's what Heschel says is necessary. And one more thing, and this connects with the stories you told, those wonderful stories, because he feels that in losing that religious way of looking at the world, we've lost the deep urgency of certain ethics, the certain urgency of justice, and urgency of seeing the cruelty and the callousness and the brokenness of the world. I mean, he's really hurt by racial prejudice. He's really hurt by the hatred that he experiences around the world, leveled at Jews and others. He's really hurt by the violence and the brutality of that days, the Vietnam War. He feels these things very personally. And it's the loss of religion that has led us to this kind of moral crisis in the world. And that's the deep connection between his ethics and his theology.
Yep, I agree. But let's look at the dangers of the Heschel move, all right? Because ultimately, 50 years after his death, we can say there is a sadness here that Heschel's impact, if you survey, for example, young rabbis, the chances of them listing Rosenzweig or Buber or something like that as their most important influences is much greater than listing Heschel. He was unique, but he didn't have a lot of impact and followers. And I think one of the reasons is the danger of his move. Let's look at the move, which you beautifully described and connected, and I tried to explain as well, between Judaism and the secular world. Well, that leads you into the realm of politics, all right? Now, it's fine, I think, let's say, take civil rights. I mean, you'd have to be some kind of racist to say the struggle for civil rights was wrong. There's no other version of the civil rights struggle that says, no, it's good that Blacks have to eat at different lunch counters. I mean, it's a clear moral commandment. And King felt that, and Heschel felt that. So they guessed right on that. The Vietnam War, I mean, I opposed it, you opposed it, a lot of people opposed it, that's why it ended. But the Vietnam War is an example of where sometimes you guess wrong on a political thing. It might have been that communism in Southeast Asia needed to be addressed. And it may be that that was the wrong choice. So you have to be very guarded and careful, because Judaism is not a political source book. And people now who use it to justify whatever political view they have, I think are misdirecting. And I think they're misinterpreting Judaism in its essence. Judaism is not a support for any one political party. It's not a support for any one Weltanschauung, worldview in politics. And that's the danger of it. You have to be very careful when you use your religion to support the politics that you already believe in.
I agree with that, but I think that what he's trying to point out, first of all, is to be engaged.
Yes.
That what bothered him most of all wasn't that people disagreed with him. It was a positive. People simply didn't care. and that there's an indifference to political issues in the country. That's number one. And number two is that there are certain moral issues which are very clear to us. In this case, racial prejudice.
Yeah.
And here too, I think he and King came together in understanding that the Bible demands a certain moral urgency. And instead of the kind of ameliorist philosophy, which was, I mean, when King writes from the Birmingham jail to all of his fellow preachers in the South, and what he's attacking is that ameliorist attitude. Well, we'll change slowly, we'll change carefully. And he's talking about the infliction of terrible cruelty, brutality, and indignity on African Americans, on Black folks. And he said, enough is enough ameliorism. It's time to do something bold and time to do something important about moving this country and moving this hatred out of our way. And I think Heschel's saying exactly the same thing.
Yeah, I agree.
Exactly the same thing. This, number one is engagement. And number two is that when you identify a moral issue, it's to feel the urgency of the thing.
Right. My only point is you have to be careful in identifying a moral issue.
Right.
And even when you identify it, you have to be careful on which solution to that moral issue you're endorsing as the teaching of Judaism. I've seen it where really, I've had people call me and they say, Marc, we want to issue a statement and we already know what we want to say, but we don't have the Jewish support for it. Could you give us a few verses that would support what we want to say already? I said, no, I won't do that. Because you're just using me to decorate your political views. You're not using me to inform your political views. It's a very big difference.
I understand that.
The second thing I would bring up about Heschel, which of course is my main hot button, thanks to my time with Father Tom, was in fact in the interview, which was, what was it, just a few months before he died?
6 weeks before he died. Right.
That's right. They ask him, well, what do you think will happen after you die? And he brushes it off. His answer is, I'll let God decide what happens when I die.
Right.
He won't say. One of the great and ennobling teachings of Judaism is that death is not the end of us. I'm saying this every time I can, even when it's irrelevant to the question that's asked. I'm trying my best. And that, I believe, is also the source of the decline of Judaism, because people want hope, and that is a source of hope. So I was concerned about that piece of Heschel, that he didn't embrace that and understand that that was a part of what had made Judaism great.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a fair point. That's a fair point, because Hasidism, the world that he came from, acknowledges a world to come, but it's not the most important thing.
I think that's the exact reason.
It's not the most important thing. The most important thing for Heschel was to try and get secular, scientifically minded, skeptical Americans to be able to, at least number one, to understand the legitimacy, the integrity of a religious point of view. And number two, to identify with it. And there's a serious question there about whether he's, how successful he was at that. Certainly in explicating it, in letting us see how he sees the world through his poetry. The language is an important element in the philosophy, because the poetry, that kind of poetic thinking, that kind of poetic language, is a way of engaging us to be able to see what we don't normally see, to open ourselves up to something we don't normally open. I think the way an artist does that.
Yeah.
I think you stand in front of a Van Gogh, how many people in human experience have painted flowers? Everybody, including my kids. We still have them on the refrigerator door. And yet we will go across the world to see a Van Gogh, sunflower, a Van Gogh irises, because Van Gogh wanted us to see the pulsating force of life that there was within every simple flower, the pulsating force that is within his own bedroom or in the starry night. And for Heschel, that's the equivalent of what Heschel's trying to do. He wants us to understand the presence of God in the ordinary experiences, but they have to be appropriated in a very different way. You have to open in a very, very different way. Now, the poetry, the poetry, the language he uses, he's never going to prove anything. There's no proof for the existence of God. There's no demonstration of the truth of the Torah. What he's doing instead is saying, look at the world through my eyes and consider what you've lost in having lost that perspective on life. Consider, the very famous story also is that he would begin every lecture, he'd whisper into the microphone, ladies and gentlemen, a great miracle just happened. The sun just went down. And then he would begin talking, and you realize that the fact that you didn't rush to the window to see the sunset means that there's something missing inside of us. We're missing a sense of wonder, a sense of mystery, a sense of awe. And because we're missing those qualities and become so functional and so efficient in the world, the sun goes down, I put the sun visor on the freeway so I can see out the windshield. It becomes so functional that you've lost a part of yourself, which is the part of yourself that might just give you a sense for the meaningfulness of your existence. And brilliant. That's his claim.
True, that's it. Let me support that with this quote, which proves exactly your point. Look, Shabbos, right? For observant Jews, Shabbos comes at Shabbos. But who thinks of Shabbos this way? This is Heschel's description of Shabbat. To set apart one day a week for freedom, a day on which we would not use the instruments which have been so easily turned into weapons of destruction, a day for being with ourselves, a day of detachment from the vulgar, of independence, of external obligations, a day on which we stop worshiping the idols of technical civilization, a day on which we use no money, a day of armistice in the economic struggle with our fellow men and the forces of nature. Is there any institution that holds out a greater hope for man's progress than the Sabbath?
So my teacher, Harold Schulweis, was a rabbinical student when Heschel came to JTS.
Really?
And Harold was a disciple of Mordechai Kaplan. And Mordechai Kaplan's philosophy was diametrically opposite to Heschel's. What Kaplan tried to do, of course, is to translate Judaism into secular language, into at least American secular language. And,
folk customs.
Oh, yeah. And Schulweis was much taken up with that kind of rationalism and the naturalism of Kaplan's philosophy. And but he was a philosophy major, so he had to take Heschel's class. So he tells us a story. He says, so Heschel says the first session of its medieval philosophy, the first session will take place at my home on Saturday afternoon. So the boys in his class are all men, young men. They come over to Heschel's apartment. They sit at the table. Mrs. Heschel fixes them some tea and some cookies. And instead of beginning a session on Maimonides or Halevi or any of the other great philosophers, he begins singing a nigun, yada dai 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 dai, yada dai 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 dai, yada dai, and he's listening for this, and Schulweis realizes that Heschel isn't looking for students. Heschel is looking for disciples, and Heschel's not a professor. Heschel is a Rebbe, and he's not offering academic learning the way that you and I learned in school and graduate school, the way Schulweis expected to learn. He's offering a sort of life wisdom. And the same thing, if you read him as a philosophical text and you take notes and you write a critique, it's very easy to critique him because his language is obscure. It's elusive in both senses. Elusive, which means it's hard to grasp, and it's elusive. It's pushing beyond. It's very easy to read him that way. But what you really want to do if you want to know Heschel is you've got to sit down and have a conversation with him as if he were a great spiritual master inviting you into his domain. And be ready to let him change your life. Because if you're ready to let him change your life, a remarkable thing happens as you begin to read. You begin to understand the world in very different ways. The section you read is a beautiful section from this book, The Sabbath. Now, you imagine how somebody's going to write a book about Shabbos. You know, what is Sabbath? Where does it occur in the Bible? How do we observe it? Has not any of that stuff. He doesn't do any of that stuff. He starts out by saying, let's think of two ways of imagining existence, space and time. We live in a civilization which is thoroughly devoted to space, to things, to images. But what would it be like to turn that off one day a week and instead be sensitive to time, to find holiness in time, to find value in time? It's a whole different way of thinking about existence. And the only way to really appreciate it is to go with him in this and to sit with him and let him touch you. And if you do that, it's quite remarkable.
So let me ask you, my friend, you are the inheritor, the disciple of Harold Schulweis, and you love Heschel. So how do you come down on the Mordecai Kaplan Heschel index? Where did you strike your roots?
That's actually worth a whole session, I think, because I think we've talked about Heschel today. Kaplan offers a whole different way of understanding the world.
For you.
No, but I just want to say, but what's so amazing is that in the 1950s, when Schulweis was studying with Heschel, and in the 60s when I grew up, and even in the 70s when I went to rabbinical school, Kaplan was the reigning philosopher. If you went to synagogue, people spoke Kaplanian language about Jewish peoplehood, about Jewish civilization. And it was only in the 80s and the 90s when the word spirituality re-entered our vocabulary and religious experience re-entered our vocabulary that Heschel became the preeminent philosopher. And today, almost nobody studies Kaplan. Everybody reads Heschel. Heschel is in any synagogue, Reformed conservative synagogue that you want to go to. Orthodox, not so much, but they have other thinkers who were similar to him. But in Reformed and conservative synagogues, you listen to sermons, you're going to hear a lot of Heschel. You're going to hear a lot of Heschel.
Your teacher was a Kaplanian.
My teacher was a Kaplan, but he
What about you? What did you take, as they say about Rabbi Meir and Elisha ben Abuya, who was a great heretic? How can you study with this heretic? He says, well, it's like an orange. I squeeze out the good juice and I throw the pulp away.
Right. And I think that some synthesis between the two is where the future of American Jewish religious thought is going to exist. I mean, fundamentally, and this is very simplistic, so forgive me for this, but what Kaplan is trying to do is raise up Jews to the level of Judaism. What Heschel's trying to do is raise up Jews to the level of his Judaism. And what Kaplan is trying to do is to bring down Judaism to the level of American Jews. And somewhere in the middle, there is a meeting point between the two. And I used to speak about this with Rabbi Schulweis all the time. And I think one of the places in the middle is that there is something poetic and mystical and spiritual about belonging to the Jewish people. And that within our experiences of, as Kaplan would say, the power that makes for salvation, there is a great deal of Heschel's wonder and mystery and awe. They never talked to each other. Well, they actually liked each other. They were very good friends. Their offices were across the hall from each other on the 6th floor. Kaplan was a complete outcast at JTS because he'd been put in Cherem and Heschel was the only faculty member at JTS who would be close to him, would speak to him, would ride up in the elevator with him. They would sit in their offices and write terrible things about each other, but then sit and eat lunch together. And when they had an 80th birthday for Mordecai Kaplan, Heschel was the keynote speaker because they were very good friends, because they respected each other, respected each other's learning. They were both Orthodox Jews in their practice, so they davened together in the same synagogue. But I think that the meeting point between the two is that you can find Heschel's poetry and mysticism in Kaplan's religious experiences of peoplehood and the God who is immanent, the God who is here with us in our world. And that's, I think, one of the things that Rabbi Schulweis, my teacher, was trying to do.
Hmm. And that's where you're trying to arrive at.
And that's what I'm trying to get to, too. But you have to acknowledge you're coming from very different worlds.
A third thing I wanted to talk to you about with Heschel is, and this does relate to, be careful about connecting Judaism to politics, because it's fine if you're trying to eliminate the racial discrimination, where everyone of any kind of heart understands this is a moral obligation. Heschel left HUC, Hebrew Union College, who had been responsible for his freedom, because he didn't like the level of observance there. It wasn't frum enough for him. And that was a hurt. I went to HUC, of course, and I heard and inherited the hurt of Heschel leaving. It was a great insult. Heschel taught at a place which did not count women in a million. Heschel taught without one word of dissent in a place which did not have women, couldn't ordain women as rabbis. What you would think that a man who was whose political sensitivities, whose moral sensitivities, a professor of ethics, would have understood that it's not just Black people being able to sit at the same cafe that white people are sitting at and drink from the same drinking fountains. Women were an oppressed majority, actually, and Judaism had been part of that oppression. HUC, to their credit, and in my class, 50 years ago, ordained the first woman, Sally Priesand. JTS was still fumphing around, figuring, oh, yes, no, maybe, who knows? Finally, they did, of course, but Heschel was absent in the struggle for feminism. What do you make of that?
It's a wonderful question. So if you read Edward Kaplan's biography,
Yeah.
the wonderful 2-volume biography of Heschel, he describes Heschel's experience at HUC. You're right, HUC saved him. They rescued him from Europe and brought him to America. And, he had a few people there that he could relate to. He couldn't eat in the cafeteria. He couldn't pray in the synagogue. There were a family or two in Cincinnati that took him in and gave him a connection with community, but he was a profoundly lonely man. And he switched to JTS hoping to find a community. And he found a little bit. He found some of the scholars of JTS and the synagogue he could pray in. But the fact is that he was just as lonely at JTS as he was at HUC. In fact, in some ways, even more so, because JTS advertised itself as a traditional institution, and Heschel found it spiritually dead, intellectually very exalted, great Talmud scholars who didn't give him the time of day because they were Litvaks and they were scientific scholars of the Talmud and of the Bible. And he was this chassid trying to engage people spiritually, and they didn't understand him. And his students, by the way, he's a terrible classroom teacher, horrible. But what he would do is he would choose a few students each year who sort of got him. Arthur Green, Sam Dresner, Himmelman, Baruch Friedman Cohen, some great scholars, some great rabbis, and they would become sort of his disciples. They would walk home. His classes were terrible, but if you got to walk him home on Shabbos morning from shul, that's where you got to learn with Professor Heschel. And, so spiritually he was.
So how did he miss feminism, Eddie?
Well, feminism, hang on a second. But what's important is that the people who were his spiritual peers, and you're going to appreciate this, were the people he found in the Christian world.
Yes.
Reinhold
Richard
Niebuhr,
Newhouse.
Reinhold Niebuhr, the great Protestant theologian who was teaching across the street at Union Theological.
Yep, that's true.
Martin Luther King, and
that's absolutely true.
the Catholic, and William Sloane Coffin, who was the minister of Riverside Church. These were the people that he resonated to, because even though they spoke a different religious language, they understood his spirituality and his moral urgency.
They had thick beliefs.
Right. Which is the same way that you and Tommy, Father
Yes.
Tom, got along and were so effective in communicating religious commitment, even though you came from very different religious worlds and spoke different religious values, because there's a sort of common spiritual vocabulary that you share. And that's what he found in those people. His daughter applied to become a rabbi and they turned her down. And
Yes,
Heschel said that had he had the power, he would have ordained her. But the fact is that feminism wasn't on his agenda at that moment. Relations with the Catholics were. He went to Rome on Rosh Hashanah to try to talk to the Catholic Church about removing the anti-Semitism from its liturgy. Relations with the African-American community was important. His opposition to the Vietnam War was important. And in the JTS community, all of that was strange. They were like, what are you doing? Like, the story about him praying with his feet is also an answer to the people at JTS who said, why do you care about those people?
Right.
And, and so this was all of a piece of his loneliness in the world. He's, Soloveitchik wrote the work, The Lonely Man of Faith, but Heschel lived it. Heschel really lived a lonely life.
You see, I have a different take on that. I think there was a reason why he missed feminism and missed the struggle of women for equal standing. And that is, he really was in love with traditional Jewish life.
Right.
And he wanted, and his focus was not on the limitations of that life,
right,
the blindness of that life, the patriarchy of that life. His focus was on translating that life to Christians and Jewish seekers.
The moderns, yeah.
I think that's why he really didn't have it in his heart. And I can echo that. In the early days of my anti-war stuff in the 60s, I can tell you there wasn't one member of SDS I knew who was sensitive to the women's movement. Not one.
Right.
It was all very, very male-oriented, very chauvinistic. And so I think it does reinforce for me my view that it's the beliefs of Judaism properly understood and transformed when they are not sensitive to the modern world that we really need to reinforce. It's not the old ways and putting a poetic gloss over the old life and the old ways. Anatevka was a terrible place to live, despite Fiddler on the Roof. It was poor, it was sexist, it was dangerous. And that world, which the Hasidim were so in love with, that world, there's nothing about that world, really, that I want recreated. And that's just me. There's nothing about it.
Mm-hmm.
But the beliefs of Judaism, well, that's another matter.
So I suspect that had he lived another 10 years, that feminism would have become something. At JTS in 1972, there wasn't any women clamoring to become a rabbi. His daughter.
Wait a second. That was the year Sally was ordained.
At HUC, but not at JTS. At JTS, it was a close. Listen, we got there in 77, and my wife was one of 7 women. There were very few who had the courage to stand up and say, we want to be rabbis.
Well, Sally broke down.
Right.
The barrier.
That's right. But
I
think that there's much to be learned here. So I want to recommend to everybody this Shabbos to celebrate Heschel's yahrzeit and to bring him close. Open up the book, The Sabbath, and just read it slowly. You don't read Heschel quickly, by the way. You can read Feinstein quickly. You can read Gellman quickly.
Oh, yeah.
But you don't read Heschel. You got to read him very slowly, almost like a meditation text, because each line is poetic, but each line is trying to adjust and change the way that we experience life. Marc, we pray for Mara's health and strength and recovery, and wish you a very good Shabbos, and to everyone listening, a very, very good Shabbos. You stay tuned. Valley Beth Shalom service comes on at 10 o'clock Shabbos morning. And to all of you, a very, very pleasant and wonderful Shabbos. Whatever weather is about to hit you, stay warm, stay safe, and come back and see us next week. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom, my friend.